Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Sanjay Patnaik. I'm the Director of the Center on Regulation and Markets at the Brookings Institution, and it is a real pleasure to welcome you here to this joint event on climate finance at scale for global decarbonization. This event has been put together jointly by the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, the E-Axis Forum, and the Brookings Center on Regulation and Markets. As we all know, the climate conference, COP29, starts next week. And so when we look at the trends around the world, we see that global emissions continue to rise. And although we see reductions in developed economies, we see a lot of increases in emerging and developing economies, or in short, EMDs. And so in order to actually make progress at a global scale, we need to focus on financing mechanisms. We need to focusing on decarbonization, especially in EMDEs, and in policies that can help facilitate a decarbonization across the world, and not only in the developed world that already has made quite a lot of strides. Today's event will feature some very outstanding experts. It's a real pleasure to have them here today. We will have Alissa, she is a visiting assistant professor at Cornell University. We have Avinash Persaud, he's the special advisor on climate change to the president of the Inter-American Development Bank and former architect of the original Bridgetown Initiative for International Financial Reform. We have Lisa Sachs, she's the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at Columbia University, and we have Bella Tonkonogy. She's a senior advisor at the US Treasury Secretary's Climate Hub. I want to emphasize again that when we look at climate in a global context, and this will be a really big emphasis at COP next week, we need to start thinking about how we can facilitate climate action and decarbonization in those countries that maybe don't have the funds. And so actually COP29 that starts in Baku next week is focused on setting quantified goals for climate finance in order to significantly increase the 100 billion annual climate finance pledge that we know from the previous climate conferences, to actually increase it significantly to what is needed. And so we're going to start off with a presentation by Alissa, who is going to give an overview of some of the issues at hand before I turn it over to some of the other panelists. Alissa, over to you. If you want to share your slides, please. And turn on your radar.
Sure. Are you able to see this?
Yeah, looks good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Oh, yes. So let me make sure. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Sanjay, for the very kind introduction. And I must say, I'm really, really pleased to be here today with Avinash, Bella, and Lisa. They are true experts on the topic. So I'm so excited to hear their perspectives soon. And thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you as well to the organizers. So today I will be talking about the economic case for climate finance at scale in the context of the COP29 new quantified goal of climate finance that is set to be agreed between developed and developing countries. The outline of my presentation is that I first will briefly give the economic case for climate finance at scale now. Then I will talk about what that implies for what a good new quantified goal of climate finance should at least contain, and how an ambitious new quantified goal of climate finance will feed into the 2025 update of the nationally determined contributions by countries across the world to try to align their policies with the Paris Agreement. So let me start with the first component. So the big picture point is that if we in the developed countries do not offer climate finance at scale to developing countries, ultimately we are the ones that are going to suffer climate damages that are far greater than the mitigation climate finance that we would offer to them to bring down emissions that ultimately come at lower climate damages for us and also lower adaptation costs. So if you just look at the US in the last few weeks, we've seen Hurricane Helene and Milton, which are collectively estimated to have cost $300 billion of damages. And just compare that for a second to the $100 billion that is currently offered from developed to developing countries each year. It's already a triple factor of 3. And these climate damages are only going to escalate if we are not able to bring on board EMDEs now. And it's not just America, it's across the developed world. We just saw the floods in Valencia. We don't know the billion-dollar damage, but over 210, I believe, people died, and some are still missing. So the point is that there's no safe climate haven. And if we want to act in our own economic interest, in our own interest of our citizens, it is in our interest, as I will show, to help decarbonize the rest of the economy, because otherwise we're going to face these escalating climate damages. And this is even especially important today because according to the United Nations new report, we are currently as a world headed to 3.1 degrees of warming. And at the moment, the remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees stands at less than 200 gigatons, or the equivalent of just less than 5 years. Now, of course, you might think, oh, we just exceed the 1.5 degrees, but it turns out that every 0.1 degree above 1.5 significantly increases the adverse climate risk that we face, potentially catastrophic, and the risk of crossing so-called climate tipping points, which in a very non-linear way may make climate damage a lot worse. For example, if the Atlantic Marine Ocean circulation collapses, can cause a lot of other tipping points to be crossed, including the dieback of the Amazon rainforest. And also, it turns out it's actually very dangerous to temporarily overshoot the 1.5 degrees to aim to get back, because A, we don't know, carbon capture and scale is not proven at scale. It's currently not economically viable. And in the meantime that you overshoot, you might actually, you will cause a lot more damages all over the world, including in the global south, which is very unjust. So this makes the imperative for climate finance at scale so important now. Importantly, climate finance at scale has to be directed at phasing out fossil fuels, because the climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis. Over 37 gigatons out of the 42 are caused by fossil fuels. So if we want to halt the climate crisis, we must phase out fossil fuels early and replace it with renewables. And the current climate policy, which is primarily directed at renewable addition, is not good enough. I will argue in my presentation we have to focus on fossil fuel replacement. As Sanjay already alluded to, even though the West has started to decarbonize, the EU by 7.5% from 2020 to 2023, even I think 37% since 1990s, also the US has started to decarbonize. Emissions in EMDE economies like China and India are rapidly growing, and in other non-OECD countries. So there is going to be no global transition. We're not going to be anywhere close to 1.5 degrees unless we bring EMDEs on board at scale in time. So why is climate finance so important? Because carbon taxation alone is not going to do it. Currently, only 24% of greenhouse gases are priced, and the average global carbon price minus fossil fuel subsidies is around $4 per ton of CO2. So we should, of course, also do mandates and regulations. And also financial markets are not alone going to do it. There's new papers in the climate finance academic literature showing that the cost of capital differential between brown and green firms are too small to make a difference. And they would need to be over 18 basis points to replicate $100, $180 per ton of CO2 carbon tax, which seems unreasonable. And they cannot deal with asset stranding. So in that world where carbon taxation alone won't do it, financial markets alone can't do it, there's an extremely important role for climate finance at scale, not just by the private sector, but by the public sector. So this is what I want to, but the problem is that so far climate finance at scale, if you define it in a way as subsidies also by the public sector, has mostly been deployed at scale within borders. So we've seen in the US, the IRA, in Europe, the Green Deal, which has helped them decarbonize. But again, if you just look at the EU example, even though they've decarbonized rapidly, their climate damages are rapidly intensifying because their decarbonization is not enough. So there's an economic case for them to go offer climate finance at scale across borders. And this is exactly what Brian Dees also argued in his Foreign Affairs article on the case for a clean energy Marshall Plan. So what I've done in my academic work is I looked at all, in this case, at the most polluting fossil fuel, coal. We took all power plants all over the world, and we asked a simple question, which is, what are the costs and benefits of phasing out coal? And basically, we say that there are two costs of phasing out coal. The first one is the investment cost to build something in its place, because the primary objective is to meet energy demands. So it's the investment cost in renewables and supporting technologies like short and long-term batteries and the grid. But the second cost is the opportunity cost of coal, which is essentially the stranded asset value of closing coal or fossil fuels early, so the missed cash flows to owners, and retraining costs and missed wages to workers. So the compensation for the opportunity cost, of course, is incredibly important, not just because it makes the transition just, but also because it alleviates political opposition to the transition. And again, just renewable addition is not enough. We need to do fossil fuel phase out. So you need to pair any phase out of fossil fuels with the phase-in of renewables. And so what we show in this paper, and as you can see here, is that globally, the net economic benefits minus cost of phasing out coal are over the course of this century at least 36 trillion, sorry, this is up to 2050, for a very conservative estimate of the social cost of carbon of $80 per ton of CO2, and 87 trillion for a more reasonable, still a conservative estimate of the social cost of carbon of 190. So I mentioned the two costs. The benefits are essentially the avoided climate damages globally at a minimum, but also, and the avoided adaptation costs, which you can estimate with this global social cost of carbon, but also locally, there are, of course, air pollution benefits and other benefits, which we are not even capturing here right now. Now, of course, we know that there's no global government. So even if we basically, as we showed here, we basically showed that there's an economic case globally to, even if the public sector had to pay for all opportunity costs of closing fossil fuels early and all the investment costs of replacing it with renewables. And essentially, aside from the Pigovian approach of carbon taxation, which is using taxation to internalize the externality, there's also an economic case which is based on the Cogent approach, where essentially you're saying paying the polluter is sound economic logic if it makes you economically better off. But of course, we don't have a global government. We have country level decision makers. So what we would like to know is, how are the benefits from a climate finance deal distributed across the world? Which you can do with what is called the country level social cost of carbon, where we know that the sum of the country level social cost of carbon adds up to the global social cost of carbon. So what we now ask is, what is the country benefit if it had to pay completely for its own phase out of coal and its replacement with renewables? And we find it for most countries, it's negative, because their share of the global benefit from phasing out coal, here we're not taking air pollution into account, is smaller than their benefits, even for more rich social cost of carbon of $190 per ton of CO2 globally. But what we find is that even though for many of these emerging developed market economies, it may not be in their own interest, which may explain some of the inaction, aside from that they don't have enough wealth maybe to pay for it, is that there's an economic case for developed countries to pay for decarbonization in EMDEs, covering their full opportunity cost of coal and their and part of their investment costs in renewables. So what we show here at the bottom plot, for example, is that if advanced countries were to pay completely for the entire coal phase out of emerging economies, their benefits would exceed their cost by 131%. And likewise, if they help pay for the entire decarbonization away from coal of developing economies, it's 200%. Of course, they may not want to pay all, so we also do consider a scenario where they only pay up over and beyond the private benefits of that country. So importantly, climate finance here ought to consist of grants to pay for early closure of fossil fuels and grant equivalent money to help crowd in private capital for the phase-in of the renewables to replace coal. Where here we're assuming that 25% of grant equivalent money is needed to crowd in a private capital. So ultimately, the public sector doesn't have to pay everything itself. Importantly, thus far, if you look at how multilateral development banks have operated, they seem to think, if you look at their operations, that giving grants is charity. No, it's quite to the contrary. Giving grants to pay for early coal closure is actually an investment with a huge economic return, because the benefits that the financier countries would reap far, far, far exceed the cost. And likewise, MBD should not just do loans, but provide grant equivalent money. Now, I just showed you that there is an economic case for developed countries to pay for EMD decarbonization, even if they had to pay for all the closure of coal. Now, of course, the question remains, is it fiscally affordable? And rich countries would love to say that it's not. But what we show in this paper is that actually it's also imminently affordable for developed countries. For example, if you assume that with 25% public funds, 75 of private funds can be crowded in, then we find that the cost to the G7 and the EU, which could be one of such financier coalitions, is less than 0.3% of their GDP for all EMDEs, excluding China, and even less over the longer time horizon up to 2050, because renewables actually become cheaper over time. So how do developed countries currently fare with regards to climate finance? Well, currently, they're only basically paying 100 billion a year, which was the pledge made at 2009 at COP15 and taken up as part of the Paris Agreement. And this 100 billion a year goal was met late in 2022. But actually, even worse, if you go to the Oxfam Climate Finance Report, a lot of that 100 billion that is now provided is A, it's private finance money, two, it's non-concessional loans that really shouldn't count as climate finance, or it's concessional loans that are counted to their full degree as climate finance. So if you actually look at, right, like this is the composition of the climate finance by the public sector in the last year, if you actually look at what is the grant equivalent amount that is currently provided, it's only 20 billion. And this is typically taken out of the official development aid budget of these countries under the notion that offering climate finance is basically development aid, it's charity. Whereas what we show in this paper is that climate finance at scale for EMDEs is not just a moral obligation, it's not just equitable, it's also in our economic interest. And this is a big departure from the way that the Paris Agreement talks about climate finance, because in the Paris Agreement, there's under Article 9, the idea that developed countries have an obligation to take the lead in mobilizing climate finance for EMDEs, given their greater historical emissions and greater wealth. And that's of course true, they do have a moral obligation. But the difficulty is if it's just a moral obligation, most countries are not willing to pay at scale because they feel it's charity. So what William Nordhaus says is, climate change is a $1 trillion problem, which requires a $1 trillion solution. So you better have a robust incentive structure. And so what we propose, what we show is that there is an economic case in the financial incentive of the West to pay for this. If you pay for early closure, you make it in the economic incentives of coal communities and fossil fuel communities to partake, and Germany had successful auctions where these coal plants did partake voluntarily. And by using blended finance, you make it in the financial interest of the private sector to partake, not because they're ESG or they're necessarily moral, but because it's actually in their economic interest. So I think I need to wrap up because I'm sort of out of time. But there have been some pioneering, so I'll just do one more minute. So there have been pioneering just energy transition partnership deals where actually a coalition of developed countries have offered public climate finance to EMDEs, like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Senegal, which were aiming at phasing out coal early and phasing in renewables early, where half of the money was provided by the private sector, the banks that signed up to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, and it was meant to be a just deal. Now, what is the problem with the existing? So these partnerships are really, really promising, but the problem is that they have so far not reached scale. They should be replicated across other countries, and much of the funding has been offered in the forms of loans, and not enough money at all. The Indonesian deal, only 2% was grants, which meant that it's really, if in Indonesia, because the grid is already oversupplied, they actually cannot add renewables unless actually coal is phased out first, for which they didn't get enough money. So there must be enough grant money to close coal, and not just loans, but basically at-risk capital to help crowding private funding. And then you can replicate these deals with many other countries that have expressed interest in this, like Colombia and Kazakhstan and so on. So the final slide I want to show you is the slide on the new quantified goal of climate finance. this new quantified goal is going to have, as any element, it's going to have the following components. What's the quantum? What's the time frame? What's the thematic scope? What's the sources? And what are the qualitative elements? So the quantum is essentially, right, like how much public funds ought to be provided. So based on our research, just for coal alone, there must be 190 billion a year of grant equivalent finance. And for the outer quantum, which includes private finance and helps to basically align financing flows with Article 2A(c) of the Paris Agreement, including public, it's 800 billion a year, again, for coal alone. Separately, there has to be a goal for adaptation and loss and damage. Time frame, my research shows it has to be now. No slow phasing of climate finance. Any slow phasing is going to cost developed countries escalating climate damages. At full scale climate finance of 190 billion has to start now. It has to be in grant equivalent terms. And MBD should shift their business models to not just do project-based finance for the EMDs, but help to support the country's system-wide transition, which is in pioneering form established with these JETP deals that have some issues, but I do think are very promising in their prototype of offering the system-wide transition. Then to conclude, if there's not sufficient climate finance committed as part of the the new quantified goal of climate finance at COP29, many EMDEs will feel they do not have enough money to implement ambitious NDCs that are aligned with the Paris Agreement, which next time happens in 2025. And the next time after that, when there's another update of the NDCs, only 2030. We will be out of the carbon budget by 2030. So you can readily see how incredibly critical this COP29 is, because the degree to which climate finance is offered is going to trickle down directly into country level ambitions and will determine whether these remain as they are currently off track with the Paris Agreement, heading towards 2.8 degrees, or whether with sufficient climate finance, these EMDEs are offered an opportunity to set and finance Paris-aligned NDCs. I thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alissa. That was a really great overview. Avinash, I want to bring you in here, and I know you're in Baku already for the COP conference. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your perspective and your work at the IDB and how you see these mechanisms unfold for climate finance between developed and developing countries?
Well, let's build on Alissa's very important presentation, highlighting the economic case for global investment in mitigation. I work as a former climate negotiator, trying to get change done on the ground, now at a development bank, having previously worked for a developing country on the finance side. And the world I see out of my window is one in which aid budgets are not going up. I often quip that people are not sending money to foreigners, they're deporting foreigners. We are lucky, I think, if aid budgets went up by 10 or 20%. Aid itself is being redefined to include things that we would perhaps not normally think of as aid. A big chunk of the UK aid budget goes to dealing with the refugee issues, some of which are a significant chunk is money being spent in the UK itself. So that is the world I see. And in an effort to get finance and deal with this $1 trillion problem when aid is not going up, we've created all these magical illusions, I call them. Things like the voluntary credit market. So I believe markets will play an important role on dealing with emissions and dealing with nature positive investments. But these are markets where it's very clear, partly through government intervention, where we have good prices that relate to the value of the nature and the climate we're trying to support. Voluntary doesn't work. It's as if economists said, well, you don't need to worry about social externalities because the private sector will voluntarily internalize them. it doesn't work, and it hasn't worked. And the price of these credits is so low that it has actually itself fueled the lack of integrity. You can't invest heavily in integrity when the price of a credit is 1/50th of what the actual price needs to be to generate the kind of change we need. So how do we do this? Well, I think a very interesting observation is that in the developed countries, much climate mitigation is now commercially viable. 81% is being funded by the private sector. Solar and wind are now highly cost effective. They've been so since 2015. Our challenge is that's not the case in the developing world. And that's not because they don't have the right policies, they don't have the right sector regulation, they don't have our expertise, which is often the perspective of many in the developed world, where they tend to think of development as, well, if only they had my ideas, they would be fine. Realities are very different and very challenging, and could be boiled down to one number, which is the cost of capital. So when you do a renewable energy project in Germany, the cost of capital is 3 or 4%. It makes money. Perfect. Don't need a lot of government investment or subsidy or support. You do the same technology, the same contract in South Africa, and the cost of capital is 14, 15%. It is even higher in Zambia and Gambia, 20, 24%. What is viable in the developed world is not viable in the developing world. But as Alissa and others have said, we can't say, well, we will do it all in the developed world, because the amount of decarbonization we would require in the developed world, if we put the emphasis there, is dramatically. So it is dramatic. You know, the carbon emissions consumed per head of population in the developed world is 7 times greater than what would be sustainable for every individual person in the world if we divided the emissions per capita by the population. So you'd have to collapse by 6/7 which is not of carbon emissions per person, which is not going to happen. So how do we do this? Well, we're trying to, why is cost of capital so high? It's high because these are developing countries. The investment needs outstrip domestic savings. So that's why the price of money is so high. The demand is greater than the supply. And the solution is not to increase that demand even further locally. That's just going to push the cost of capital even higher. And it's going to crowd out other important investments. We need to create a channel of capital from places where it is plentiful and cheap to places where it is scarce and expensive. And one of the big obstacles to that flow of channel are actually not project risks. They're not sector risks, partly because developing countries, they guarantee all those things to try and lure investors. And we also have the help of development banks like MIGA, who also help to guarantee those things. MIGA, part of the World Bank. But it is country risk, it is credit risk. Italy and Greece have debt to GDP ratios far outstripping almost any other developing country. But the reason why their credit ratings are better and their cost of capital is lower is they've got an ECB. That when they're in trouble, developed countries have the ability to act counter-cyclically to reduce pressure, whilst developing countries do not. When they're in trouble, their policy acts pro-cyclically. They have to raise interest rates, cut spending. They have to deepen the crisis. And investors see that. And investors see that volatility. It's not a perception problem, it's a reality problem. And so they're afraid to go to those places. So we need to find ways in which we can reduce the cost of capital, encourage the flow of capital, perhaps providing guarantees on foreign exchange or other things that dramatically reduces the obstacles that countries face. So let me end by saying if we can do that, then we can probably, and that is not costless. We need public support to create these guarantees to encourage this flow. And then there are many things the private sector will not finance. The private sector finances things for which there are revenues, but a lot of adaptation is a public good. Seawalls, flood defenses, drainage systems, and the public sector will need to be investing in those things. And many developing countries who are vulnerable to climate change don't have the capacity to do that. So we need the development banks to probably be 3 times bigger than they are, to be lending more on adaptation, low cost, long term, and also to be supporting some of these guarantees that helps the private sector coming in. So what does this mean for the NCQGs? Let me end with that. So the NCQGs, the new collective quantifiable goal, the new 100 billion, I think what's emerging is this idea that we need a number that is relevant. The $100 billion, whilst achieved, became over the past 10 years as seen as an irrelevant number. We were squabbling and fighting over it, but it wasn't relevant to the scale of climate finance we need. The independent high-level expert group says we need $2.4 trillion a year. 100 billion wasn't going to change anything. So we need a number that's relevant. The cross-border finance we need is 1 trillion. We need to state somewhere in the NCQGs that our goal is 1 trillion, that we're trying to achieve this through multiple ways, multiple sources, and broad contributions. But then we have a core element, because the developing world will not accept that as a strong enough goal. That yes, urging us to do this is great, but where's the commitment? We need a core commitment. And I think the core commitment that makes sense is a $300 billion figure. It's tripling from the 100 billion. It's coming from the developed world. But that cannot come, I don't believe that will come in grants and aid. It would be nice if it could, but I don't believe it will come. I believe that's where they need to use their capital at the development banks. They need to add more capital. Of the $300 billion, 100 billion could well come from existing multilateral development bank, long-term, low-cost lending for adaptation and for mitigation. But how do you go from 100 billion to 300 billion? We need more capital. Just $20 billion of new capital per year would allow the developed world to get up to a $300 billion figure per year of support for mitigation and adaptation. That is doable. That is possible. It's up to the shareholders, up to our politicians, if that's what they want to do.
Wonderful, Avinash. This was super interesting. I really appreciate your insights. I want to bring in Lisa here. Lisa, you do a lot of really interesting work at Columbia University. So what is your perspective on this? And I know you're on the way to Baku, so you will probably join Avinash next week. Please, over to you.
Thank you so much. The privilege, but also the challenge of going a bit later is now I've learned so much or heard so much that I want to respond to. So I'm throwing away what how I had structured what I wanted to say, because Avinash, I found your remarks incredibly important and just want to build on them and maybe add some extra dimensions. My perspective, Avinash, as you underscored so well, is that the high cost of capital in emerging markets is an extraordinarily important component of the challenge. I suppose where I want to take what you said is to take it less as a given and figure out how we adapt to it, and more to unpack that cost of capital and think about its structural components and how it can be fundamentally addressed structurally, and that addressing the structural problematic aspects of the borrowing framework for emerging economies should be part of, indeed, probably the central part of a new commitment, a new climate finance commitment. So as you already said, Avinash, and just to underscore, countries like Kenya and Nigeria and Pakistan are paying interest on their debt that are more than 1,000 basis points higher than the high income countries. And just for everyone to understand, in terms of these projects, there are kind of 2 components of the cost of capital. There's the sovereign risk and the macroeconomic factors, and then there are project-specific risks. But the sovereign risk, or the sovereign risk ratings, act as a ceiling for the borrowing or for the ratings of any subnational project. And those ratings, those risk ratings, the sovereign ratings, are determined by 3 rating agencies, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch. And based on their methodologies, as Avinash noted, but just to underscore, not a single low-income country is investment grade. And only maybe 2 or 3 lower middle income countries are investment grade. So I have been spending quite a bit of time trying to understand those methodologies, and I think that they need to be critically unpacked. First of all, just Avinash said it, but I would look at it differently, that the low GDP of developing countries is a direct determinant of their credit score. I find that problematic, not just fact, but problematic. The low GDP is determinative of their investment grade rating, irrespective of any country-specific risks. There are other factors that I think deserve critical analysis, like the population size. So a large population is afforded a positive weight in the methodology. So among low and middle income countries, basically the 3 highly populous countries, Indonesia, India, and Philippines, are accorded an investment grade rating, while most of the smaller low and middle income countries are below investment grade. That means that a country with a $10,000 per capita GDP doesn't have any practical chance of receiving an investment grade credit rating, irrespective of its growth potential, its quality of governance, its expected returns on public investment, or any of that. What makes that doubly ironic and doubly toxic, in my view, is that EMDEs, or these emerging economies and developing economies, have very high growth potential, far higher than the high-income countries under the right framework, the right investments, and so on. And so it makes the low or non-investment grade ratings doubly toxic and wrong and inaccurate in that case. And then a final component is that these high cost of capitals are particularly problematic in the context of the energy transition, because zero carbon energy systems in general are far more capital intensive than fossil fuel based energy systems. So a higher cost of capital has a major impact on the ability to finance lower carbon energy options. And it means that at the high cost of capital, the levelized cost of energy of fossil fuels is lower than for zero carbon energy, whereas at a low cost of capital, the levelized cost of energy of clean energy would be lower. So it's critically important to address the cost of capital factors. Another critical component that I would add to this is that financing this energy infrastructure in general requires long-term financing. And in addition to the high cost of capital for most developing countries, they are also caught in a growth trap involving short-term Eurobond debts or even official credits with maturities that are 10 years or lower. And so the governments are forced to, they face liquidity crises because their debts are falling due sooner than the long-term growth that would be achieved with these long-term investments that are needed to pay off these debts. So in addition to bringing down the cost of capital, another core component of the structure of the debts should be that the development loans to low-income countries should be for at least 30 years or longer, which is the time required for successful not only infrastructure projects, but long-term economic development, which would make these loans payable on the time frame. So I said that there were 2 components of risk: the sovereign risk ratings and the project-specific ratings, the project-specific risks, I should say. And my understanding, with which I fully agree, if I understand correctly, of Avinash's suggestion, to my mind, is even more a suggestion for the project-specific risks, which is what role can development banks and other catalytic capital play in guaranteeing and mitigating project-specific risks to attract private capital. I think it's equally, if not even more fundamental, that we look at and improve the sovereign risk ratings to better reflect the financing, the growth potential, and the underlying financial factors and the needs of the developing countries. So to have credit ratings, for instance, that are based on long-term growth trajectories, not just short 5 to 10 year trajectories, not categorically punishing every country because of a low GDP, particularly when a low GDP could signify even higher growth potential under the right conditions and so on, to take into account the uses of the sovereign debt, because of course it matters a lot what the debt is being used to finance. If it's being used to finance even outside of the energy system, if it's used to finance human capital, health, and so on, those yield long-term growth returns. So taking into account the use of the sovereign debt, taking into account the maturity structure of the debt, because long-term debt is inherently less risky than short-term debt. So I'm just giving examples, but there are ways in which I think that we could engage, especially the concentrated risk raters, to think about and to reform their methodologies. I will just quickly note that there are other structural issues like that Avinash surely is far more expert on, like the IMF World Bank Debt Sustainability Framework, which similarly has a blunt approach to debt, and it essentially limits overall debt by countries without accounting again for the maturity structure, the terms of the debt, and so on, when a lot of this energy infrastructure must be financed by debt. It just matters the terms of the debt. Indeed, governments should be borrowing on long-term concessional terms and so on. So, and then Avinash mentioned, and I just want to agree again, some of the other structural issues like access to credit swaps and strengthening the possibility for regional monetary clubs and so on to help in other ways to de-risk emerging market debt. So I'll maybe pause there, even though I had more to say, but I just can't help but underscore how important I think that component is. And to my mind, just to complement the quantitative recommendations that Avinash and Alissa have made for the NCGQ, I would urge also a focus on these structural issues, which I think are decisive to our achieving appropriate financing. Thanks so much, Sanjay.
This was excellent. Thank you so much for building on the other 2 points. Bella, I want to bring you in here. So you work in the Treasury Department, so you really have kind of like your finger on the US policy, and as we all know, the administration is going to change. So I would love to hear your perspective on this topic, and you are headed to Baku as well to represent the current US administration. Please, over to you.
Sure. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the invitation to this important conversation. Just as context for everyone listening, I'm a senior advisor in Treasury's Climate Hub. So we're a hub that was established at the beginning of this administration. We're in the Secretary's front office. And our job is to coordinate climate-related work across Treasury, which includes both domestic and international programs, to communicate externally, to collaborate with others at Treasury on major climate-related projects, and to counsel the Secretary on key climate issues. As you've no doubt are aware, the Secretary is deeply committed to address climate change and has made climate a focal point of her work at Treasury and her legacy as the first female Treasury Secretary. So I'm just going to speak about 4 things here today. So first, why is climate finance economically rational? So what is our perspective on this? Alissa kicked off her presentation talking about some of the analysis, the helpful analysis they've done, and I'll give a bit of a bigger picture on that. I want to talk just a little bit, just to review what we've done over the last 4 years to advance climate finance, in particular internationally, because I think it starts to demonstrate some of the possibilities going forward, what that means for the NCQG and how the United States is thinking about the NCQG, and then a little bit on some of the main challenges going forward. I think it's important in particular to acknowledge the fact that the election this week went a different direction in the United States. So as Sanjay noted, the administration will be changing in January. So just want to leave with a few notes of thinking about what that could mean, and both for the US and the world. So let me go ahead and get started on that. Just in terms of climate finance and the way, big picture, that Treasury has thought about it and the Secretary has talked about it over the last few years. think, you know, the what I like to reference is a speech that Secretary Yellen gave in Belém, Brazil in July, where she said that neglecting to address climate change and the loss of nature and biodiversity is not just bad environmental policy, it is bad economic policy. And a lot of the way that we have thought about climate change and the rationale for climate finance is that the impacts of climate change don't stop at national borders. Climate change damages infrastructure around the world. It affects the availability and prices of energy and agricultural goods. It contributes to conflict and fragility. It threatens the stability of livelihoods and poses a challenge to global economic growth. So that is one argument why governments must engage globally, and it's a risk-based argument. We've also seen over the last few years that a more opportunity-oriented narrative, which is that the transition to a lower carbon global economy is also the single greatest economic opportunity of the 21st century. We know that we can only achieve our climate and economic goals, things like adapting and building resilience, strengthening markets, bolstering supply chains, if we also lead efforts beyond our borders. And if we don't do this, other major economies will continue to dominate in the clean technology race. So that's how we've thought about climate finance over the last few years. What have we actually done to advance it? I think everybody is aware of the significant progress we've made domestically with the Inflation Reduction Act. It gives the private sector the incentives and certainty they need to invest in clean energy. And we've seen in just the 2 years since the IRA passed, nearly $500 billion in investments in manufacturing and clean energy technology deployment. We've also indicated, and the Secretary has indicated, that as demand grows in the United States, we do know that not all of the supply will be able to be met here, nor would we want it to be. So we've been pursuing an approach the Secretary has called friendshoring, which is seeking to strengthen our economic resilience through diversifying our supply chains across a wide range of trusted allies and partners. So that's been our energy transition oriented and domestic and supply chain oriented focus. But I think we all know that climate finance isn't just about narrow economic interests. It is, the harsh reality is that the people in countries with fewer resources to prepare and respond often bear even greater costs. And World Bank analysis has demonstrated this pretty in a way that is a little bit, makes us nervous, right? That the substantial development gains that have been made over the last decades are at risk with any level of climate change, and certainly with the base case scenarios we're seeing and the impacts we're already seeing. So we've been really working to advance efforts to reform the international financial system to better support climate goals and scale climate finance for developing countries. The Secretary convened the MDBs back in 2022 to urge them to evolve their missions and visions, their incentive structures, their operational approaches, their financial capacity. And we've seen significant progress in the MDBs. You see it in the numbers where MDB climate finance reached roughly $74 billion last year. It's almost double from where it was 4 years ago, and it was a 23% increase from the previous year. But that, I think, is just the cover note, the cover numbers, and I think a lot of the incentives, the operating structures, the changes, the headroom availability that the evolution agenda is making possible, we're only starting to see the impacts of that. And we also, as Alissa noted, launched the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, which are country-led platforms that support countries' ambitions to lower emissions in line with climate goals and also to do it in a just way. And so we've seen quite a lot of progress on those as well. And next week, we are launching a few new initiatives with the MDBs and the multilateral climate funds that are going to put in place even put in place some of the things that Avi mentioned, in particular, a portfolio guarantee at the Asian Development Bank, as well as a new mechanism that will leverage financial markets to increase the availability of concessional finance. So I wanted to go into all that detail just to talk about so much of what has happened over the last 4 years and how so much of that will continue to move forward, is not dependent on who is, what the United States current political administration is. All of these efforts are continuing. They've all been executed in partnership with many other countries, and we're really excited to see the results of them play out over the next few years. So let me just talk a little bit then about the NCQG. We were happy to have met the goal in the original $100 billion goal in 2022, when developed countries mobilized nearly $116 billion to support developing countries. And we, of course, agreed in the Paris Agreement to establish a new goal before 2025. And this is, of course, one of the most essential tasks for COP29 in Baku. Our negotiators for the United States are already there, as are many people who are coming to really make sure that this goal is as robust as it can be. And we're committed to working very constructively with all the parties to establish a goal which is fit for purpose in Baku. So what we have said as the United States is that the NCQG must do 3 things. So first, the goal should reflect the magnitude of the need. It's widely acknowledged that it will take trillions of dollars in investments to keep our climate goals in reach and build global climate resilience. We need to capture this need in the NCQG and send a clear signal to actors around the world that we're serious about combating the climate crisis by scaling up our collective investments. So we do know, though, that the magnitude of these needs cannot be met by international support alone. So we have proposed a 2-layered approach, with one layer that reflects the trillions and another layer that reflects the billions. So those would be the efforts to directly support developing countries as they take ambitious climate action. So the second thing we've said is that the support goal, which is that inner layer, must be both ambitious and achievable. So it should be designed to encourage contributing parties to scale up the mobilization of climate finance, just like the $100 billion goal did. And it also has to be feasible for governments to strive seriously toward it. So if you have something that's too ambitious, that makes it very impossible for governments to reach. That is less effective than something that is ambitious and achievable. And then third, what we said is that the support goal must include new contributing parties. It's long overdue for other capable parties to step up and be part of the support goal. And certainly the existing contributors will continue their efforts, our efforts, and be part of the new goal, but we must be joined by others. So that's what we are going to Baku. In particular, the negotiators are going to Baku to discuss. Our team in the United States is led by the State Department and with some staff from Treasury who are on the negotiating team. So let me wrap up there and look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bill. And everyone else can turn on back their video, please. Now we can dive into the discussion. I'm going to take a page out of Lisa's playbook because you brought up so many interesting points that I'm going to shelve the question that I actually had prepared and really want to drive something in a little bit on kind of like the huge gap that we see in the need of financing and the willingness in developed nations to provide that financing. I mean, and so maybe there's a little bit of a pragmatism check, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. When we look around the world currently, right, like we see a lot of developed countries having fiscal issues, political upheaval. If we look at like Germany, currently we had the US election with a change in administration, very different kind of like policy outlooks, high cost of living that has played a really essential role in a lot of these countries. And so I'm curious, what are your thoughts on how developed countries could be convinced, and especially policymakers and the public, to actually invest in this, given the problems that we face fiscally in many of those countries, given that cost of living is very high. People don't put climate as top of their mind. They have a lot of other priorities, and I think we saw that in the recent elections. So I'm very curious on this. Maybe Bella, you want to start?
I mean, I feel like at this point, I'm probably the least qualified just being in the US government to answer that question. And also in an administration that is on its way out. But I think, I think there's a few things. One is the economic interest. I think that has been important over the last few years. I think the narrative of supply chain resilience is really important, and the need to work with allies, and the national security rationale for doing that is quite important. So that has certainly been something that I think has resonated over the last few years. And then I think the development narrative resonates as well, that climate change is a risk to development. I mean, we see that in the United States with the hurricanes, as Alissa mentioned, where you do see significant climate damages, or damages from climate change and from events that are magnified and intensified by climate change. And I think that the United States has historically been supportive of helping and working with countries to enhance their development, in particular low-income countries. And I think that any way to couple development and the need for development, and to understand that development is at risk due to climate change, I think that that's an area that can also achieve bipartisan support, and has in the past.
I love that. I love that point. I think especially like really elevating the economic angle and the cost aspect, even for us, I think that has been kind of like underplayed by policymakers. So I think that's a great point. Lisa, what are your thoughts on this? Sorry for the curveball here.
No, we have not wasted. We have horrifically misallocated funds for a long time, but especially for the past year, in wars that have cost lives and not saved lives. And so it's not a lack of capital, it's our choices of where we're allocating. And it's a misperception of what's in US security interests and what's in the world security interests. So I think it's just a wrongheadedness and an incredibly wrongheaded foreign policy that is responsible for how capital is allocated. It's not our living expenses domestically. Other countries in the world are getting on with it, are developing their robust supply chains, are transitioning their economies, and are transitioning their partners' economies. And I think what it's going to, and so first of all, and by the way, our US companies and our financial sector are going to be affected by those markets and those rules that are getting on with it as well. So there's also going to be regulatory interests in if not driven by the federal government, then by other economic actors in the US to be a part of the financing framework. So yeah, I think at a federal level, we have a bit of a challenge cut out. I hope that this change reflects less of an interest in foreign wars, and maybe an opportunity to think about what's in US economic interests in developing robust value chains that can come from both strengthening development around the world and strengthening the many supply chains that are part of the energy transition.
Great, thank you. Avinash, what is your thought? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so it's an important question, and I think that we've got to face the stark reality that these gaps are huge. The 100 billion is now an irrelevant figure, and we can't come up with another relevant figure. The world needs more than $1 trillion of cross-border finance per year. $1 trillion per year. Now, we could broaden and deepen coalitions, but we should point out that this is in the interest of the US as an investor and Europe as an investor. Is in the interest of the US and Europe and developed countries as technology providers, as others have pointed out. But I think with each disaster, people are beginning to understand what collective interests mean. Yeah. The US is perhaps the only country that is hit by a hurricane every year. The probability of the US being hit by a hurricane is 100%. The US is experiencing extreme heat, which is having a huge impact on the prospects for children in schools who go to school in extreme heat. And so at some point there will be a realization, I think, that it is in the US interest that the world makes a change, and we're asking the world to do something that developed countries didn't do. We're asking the world to make the biggest transformation ever in the history, and a bigger transformation than any developed country has done. You're asking India to make a transformation where its GDP per capita is 1/4 of what it was when Europe began making its transformation. So why do we expect them to do that? Why should they do that? They're not clear why they should do that. So so it's in our interest that we are helping more, and we have got the developed countries have the power of leverage, being major shareholders in MDBs and other institutions, and they should certainly be pulling that lever to the hilt.
I think you bring up two really good points, which is the investment angle, right? That it's a good investment for developed countries, and kind of like long term, maybe thinking of it kind of like a Marshall Plan for climate, right? Which in the end paid off in a lot of different dividends. But I do agree. I think there are challenges in terms of convincing developing countries, right? Like as you say, the level of development is much lower. We have reached our current level on fossil fuel, and it's very difficult for us to say, look, you have to bear all these costs, and we have this standard of living and carbon intensity that is much higher than yours. And I think you're right. There will be a lot of different incentives that need to be at play here. Alissa, I want to bring in you in here on this. You had a really good presentation looking at the gap and just at the enormity of the gap. So what are your thoughts on that question that I raised earlier?
Yeah, so first of all, by the way, thank you so much, Bella, Avinash, and Lisa. I learned a lot from your remarks, so I'm really pleased to be in this panel with you. It's a fantastic conversation. So I think what all three of you mentioned in also your remarks just now is that the importance of pointing out the economic case, right, for the West to help decarbonize the rest of the world. And in my paper, I basically point out the risk-based economic case, as Bella, nicely phrased it, right, showing that literally empirically showing that the climate finance for mitigation to bring about the rest of the world's decarbonization is a lot smaller than the climate damages that we will otherwise suffer, and we're already starting to see intensify, as all the panelists have pointed out. But I think the other part, which is not even contained in my paper, is the enormous economic opportunity that also exists that I don't fully capture in my empirical analysis. I think to answer your question, and so the important point, like building on your last remark, Sanjay, is that what we're saying in our paper is climate finance at scale for the rest of for developing countries is not just equitable. It is for that very reason you just mentioned. They are not responsible for historical emissions. They have lower GDP per capita. They have not enough wealth to do it themselves. So they cannot morally be asked to transition on their own account, right? So there is a moral case, but the stronger case for the West to act at scale is the economic case, and that's what I think should be pointing out. Now, to your point on how we can fiscally afford it, let me just, by the way, let me say one more thing on this. The new quantified goal of climate finance ought to have different sub-targets, right, for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, both an inner and an outer quantum for each. And what that inner quantum looks like will be different for each type, right? Because adaptation cannot be financed really by private capital, so it mostly has to be an inner quantum of public funds. But I just want to point out that, in my view, whilst all three are incredibly important, the very most important one is mitigation, because if we do not mitigate at scale, we are going to face higher adaptation costs. They're going to escalate, and we're going to face higher loss and damages, which are going to escalate. So mitigation has to be first, and that's also luckily where the strongest investor case is. And so what I presented in my paper, and I didn't go into the details that Lisa and Avinash went into a lot of very valuable detail into, is that what I'm saying is that grant equivalent money to crowd in private capital can indeed address this high cost of capital to essentially make it EMD investments in renewables viable. And then finally, what I show in this paper is that it's actually fiscally affordable for the West to do it. So the way I would suggest to finance this is to raise sovereign debt for developed countries. And what I show in my work is that it wouldn't raise their sovereign debt by more than 0.13%. And in a way, right, like that will not really affect the current taxpayers' money, right? They in some extent, future generations will have to pay that back. It's not a lot anyway. But they are all, future generations are also the ones that benefit from the current mitigation. So that to me seems the most logical thing to do. And then very final point, which I think also Avinash spoke about, is that currently climate finance is funded largely from official development aid budgets. So in aid, by definition, is focused on not really on the economic case, it's focused on helping as a moral obligation. Whereas the climate finance offered domestically in the West, in the Green Deal and the Inflation Reduction Act, was not offered from the development aid, but they were financed from their own main economic budget. So I think the main thing that I want to say is that climate finance should not be abroad, should not be spent from the aid budget, but from the main budget. So let me stop here and turn the floor to you, Avinash.
That's actually a great point. And Avinash, I want to bring you in here because we got a couple of audience questions that are related on this about the relationship between adaptation and mitigation and like the financing needs for that. What are your perspectives on this? Because obviously the problem is, as Alissa mentioned, if we don't mitigate, adaptation costs will be higher. However, a lot of the developing countries are already suffering much more from the effects of climate change and will have to adapt. So how do you think about that?
I don't think we can say that any one of those is more important than the other. I'm afraid both are vital. They operate at different time sort of meters. Mitigation is critical to save us in the future, but adaptation is about loss and damage today. Effectively investing $1 in adaptation today saves us $7 to $10 in the future. So it makes good economic sense too. I think that what we found is that, because there's a shortage of public money, Sanjay, people have tried to say, the private sector can do it all. But the private sector is only doing 3% of adaptation. And when the private sector even talks about adaptation, they actually mean different things. They're thinking about making buildings stronger. As a government, when I was a government, we don't care about that so much because they will do that. That's not my financing problem. My financing problem is my flood system, my drainage system, my seawalls. That's massive public infrastructure. Seawalls cost more than you can imagine, billions of dollars, and they generate no revenues. They're genuine public goods. So basically, I break things down into, forget about from a finance point of view, forget about mitigation, adaptation, loss, and damage. Think about revenues, savings, and costs. Revenues, savings, costs. Whatever generates a revenue, we can find ways of getting the private sector to do it. We may need to guarantee them. We may need to provide ways in which we can de-risk them, but they should be in the front seat. When it comes to savings, so no revenues, but strong savings, the public sector will need to be there, but they could borrow. But as Lisa said, we need new instruments that are long-term, like 30, 40, 50-year instruments, that they're long enough for them to capture those savings. A 10-year bond won't do it. So yes, that's going to be public finance. We need to reform the IMF DSA, debt sustainability analysis, to make sure that investing in reducing costs in the future is viewed as it is a fiscally prudent thing to do and not an imprudent thing to do. And then there's stuff which has no revenues and no savings. It's pure costs. A lot of that is loss and damage. That's actually outside the NCQGs, and it should remain outside the NCQGs. It will get squeezed and lost if it's in the NCQGs. The NCQGs is going to, by its nature, be a sort of stretchy finance, kind of things like development banks and concessional lending, and things that are not ideal for loss and damage. Things that are ideal for mitigation and adaptation. So I think revenue savings costs, private sector, but they need support to reduce that cost of capital. Public sector for the savings and adaptation, but they need support from regulations and the DSAs, and low cost and long term. They need new instruments, and let's get some new tax revenues on loss and damage. I was in Tokyo with the Global Maritime Forum. The maritime industry supports an $80 per ton of tax on carbon emissions from the shipping industry. Those sort of things will generate the kind of money. The problem actually is the countries who are importing the goods. So we need to design the tax in such a way that it doesn't hit any set of countries disproportionately. The Chinese are the world's big exporters. Latin America is the world's biggest importers from a long way away. And both of those object to those kind of emission taxes. But if you made it flat, if you had a cap, you could get them around.
That's actually super interesting. Lisa, what are your thoughts on adaptation versus mitigation?
I do have thoughts
on the latest point.
But both. But I can touch on both. I just, Sanjay, I mean, Avinash, of course, I have agreed with everything you said, but I just want to, again, underscore a point that you a bit take for granted, even though you're, of course, right, that in mitigation, there's more of a case for the private sector to come in. So, you know, quote unquote, we ought not worry. And in fact, I have a slide that I show my students every year of COP26, COP27, COP28, of John Kerry first and then Podesta saying the statement is we need the private sector to step up. The private sector cannot step up without addressing these systematic issues or without public capital. So it's problematic to call on it. It's problematic and it's shameful, frankly, to suggest, not of you, Avinash, of our government or of these leaders, to suggest that the private sector can or will solve the mitigation challenge, because they will not and cannot. The emerging markets right now get less than 10%, outside of China, get less than 10% of investment from climate finance. We work with the financial sector all the time, including with the financial sector that are with asset owners and others who are keen to invest in emerging markets, but they cannot by mandate, first of all, if the investments are sub-investment grade. So we've already talked about that point. And then as conceptually clear as quote unquote blended finance should be, and using guarantees and public finance to catalyze private finance, the concept has been around, but it's not working well now. It's a bit of a mess. So indeed, the private sector could and should fund mitigation. And so, Sanjay, I'll get to your point on the difference with adaptation, but just we cannot expect it to happen on its own. It won't happen on its own. You have to create the right conditions for the private sector to come in. And the conditions should be there because these are high growth opportunities. They are investments that could have returns and so on. Indeed, you've said a lot of the good points on how adaptation is different. And I do think that really, just to underscore again what you said, because it's so clear to you, but it's not so clear to others, that there are really different types of adaptation. There's adaptation in built infrastructure, in corporate projects, and there it should be part of corporate planning and investment. I don't know that it is sufficiently yet, because I don't know that they're using the proper models or even understand the ways in which they should, but that doesn't need public finance. But then, as you said, the seawalls, the ecosystem services and so on, again, will not be funded by private finance. There's no return there. So it needs to be disproportionately by public finance. And then if we want to add on top of that, I do think there's a role for innovative financial mechanisms that could, like I think you alluded to, whether using the words or not, the idea of long-term resilience bonds or other types of bonds that could be attractive to the private sector if there were long-term returns administered, by a development bank or so on. And so there are ways, I think, to bring in the private capital. But for those types of ecosystem-based, non-return-based projects, we absolutely need the public sector in the lead.
Can I just give a very quick example, Sanjay, of what Lisa and I have been talking about in terms of systemic risk? So if you're a US investor investing in a South African or Brazilian solar farm, you spend 10 percentage points of your return per year just hedging the foreign exchange. And over a 25-year plan, 25-year project, 5 percentage points per year of that will prove to be a risk premium. A risk premium because the banks are short-term, they don't like doing long-term stuff. The banks' risks are pro-cyclical, and you're asking them to hedge something that's even more pro-cyclical, so they charge a premium. And then the regulators in the US, in Europe, require them to have more capital because they're in a non-OECD country. So you add all those things together, and the premiums make it unprofitable. So that's why we've come up with a $5 billion plan in Brazil, launched in March, that we will actually offer cheap foreign exchange whenever the project needs it. They have to repay us over a long period of time. They have to repay us, but we will be there. We make a commitment, and as a result, they don't need to hedge. They don't need to spend 10 percentage points per year, and that dramatically changes the return prospect for an investor on the mitigation side. So the public sector needs to be involved in getting the private sector to be doing those things.
That's a really, thank you for bringing up that example. That is actually super innovative. Bella, what are your thoughts on this debate? You're going to have the last word today because we're getting up to the end. Words of wisdom.
What are my thoughts? Okay. So I've been thinking a lot about Asheville, North Carolina. Asheville, North Carolina is the center of climate risk data in the United States. It was largely, by people who think about these things, it was thought of as a place for climate refugees internally within the United States to move. It's far from the coast, up in the mountains. And of course, Asheville in Hurricane Helene was devastated. And, entire districts of the city were underwater, and much of the surrounding region is devastated. The main highway between Asheville and that part of North Carolina, west into Tennessee, the interstate is closed indefinitely, I think, certainly for the next few years. And that's in the United States, right? I think, Alissa, your stat on your slide was that it was a $200 billion event.
Yeah.
It's massive. That's massive for any country, including the United States. So, we've been thinking about it in terms of the fiscal impacts for our country and the challenges facing the insurance sector. Treasury has done a data call this year on climate risk faced by the insurance sector. We're planning to have a report out by the end of the year that has the results of that data call that we've been executing in collaboration with the National Association of Insurance Commissioners. And we really see this as a potential fiscal risk for the United States. So that's how we're thinking about adaptation domestically. When you think about it internationally, of course, the concern is just as important. It's important for, as Avi notes, for the public sector and for development finance and development funding, so grants, to be available for other countries to adapt to climate change. And I would just say that, I don't know that we have all the answers, right? Like this is going to be a massive challenge over the coming years. It gets harder as mitigation efforts do not meet the needs of or the requirements of a net zero scenario by 2050. So think that we need lots of new financial models. We need lots of new public sector strategies for adaptation. We need better data in all countries. And just a lot more attention paid to this over the coming years. So that's maybe, I don't know if this is where you want to leave the conversation,
I think that's a
Sanjay.
perfect-
It's not like the most positive thing going into, but I think it's.
But I think it hits the nail on the head. So this was actually great because
Sanjay,
we see what the real implications are.
Am I allowed to chip into one thing that Bella said as very briefly as a final remark? So
Sure,
yes,
last word.
I fully agree with Bella, right? That North Carolina was thought to be a climate haven, and just to sort of reiterate what she's saying, right? If the United States is not, plus all the other developed countries, is not going to bring the rest of the world on board, already today the damages are 300 billion just in the U.S., and that's going to escalate further. And compare it again to the 100 billion that is currently provided to EMDEs, right? That imbalance between domestic damages in developed countries is going to escalate further if we do not increase our climate finance right now. I just wanted to add one point that I don't think has been emphasized enough. So I'm so pleased to listen to what Avinash and Alissa are saying. That's all completely spot on what it takes for the public sector to be able to crowd in private capital for renewables in emerging and developed market economies. I just want to emphasize that the big debate is always on renewable addition, but the reality is that if we want to stay within the carbon budget, there has to be early fossil fuel phase out. So using public funds to make it possible to crowd in private capital is really important to get the renewable increases going. But as long as renewables are not yet cheaper than with batteries than fossil fuels are not going to come offline on their own. So the very basic idea that Bella has been headed with the US Treasury with these just energy transition partnership deals, and which should also be reflected in the way that nationally determined contributions are going to be implemented, is that you essentially say, what's the current energy mix of every country? What is the projection of what the energy demand will be? And what the associated emissions would be under business as usual, taking into account AI growth, growing population, needs for increased electrification, and what is the emission pathway that the country would need to follow to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, ideally 1.5 degrees, and sort of carbon budget aligned. So those two things will dictate what the emissions are that ought to be avoided at the annual level, at the country level, and basically stipulate which fossil fuels would need to come offline when, and importantly, climate mitigation finance cannot just be about renewable addition. There has to be grants, money for closure. And as I think Avinash pointed out, it cannot rely on voluntary carbon markets to pay for avoided emissions, to pay for early fossil fuel closure because the price is not high enough. So it has to be grants. And then you can compute exactly how much renewables you would need to build to replace not only the phase out early of the fossil fuels, but to replace it and to keep up with growing demand. And so I think one of the big things that me and my co-author are saying is avoided emissions is a valuable asset to the developed countries. And a large part of the avoided emissions is not just helping with renewable addition in these countries. The big chunk of avoided emissions is helping to also close coal and other fossil fuels early. And in some sense, providing grants for that is not charity. It's something that has an enormous economic return in terms of avoided adaptation costs that Bella alluded to, and avoided climate damages at home. So that's the one point that I wanted to make sure that was emphasized too.
Great. All right. On this note, I want to thank everyone, Bella, Alissa, Avinash, Lisa, for a really fascinating discussion. I want to thank the E-Axis Forum for hosting us and for Cornell to working together with us. And a lot of interesting conversations on the horizon. And good luck, everyone, to Baku, who is going next week. All the best. Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much, Lisa, Avinash,
Thank you.
Bella. Great to see you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sanjay. Really great moderation.
Yes.
I thought I would stay on for 1 second, Sanjay. I think you're on mute.
Eva, are we clear? I think. All right.